You know, we've been pretty poorly served by state governments this year. If ever we wanted proof that most of the grown-ups end up in federal politics, this was the year. When state governments needed to be wise, cool and competent, most of them have been panicked, hysterical and bungling. None of this normally matters much. The states usually handle run-of-the-mill issues: schools, hospitals, transport, law and order and energy. And often enough, they make a hash of those things. This is what governments often do. But this year, despite generous attempts by the Prime Minister to run a national cabinet for a truly national approach, we've seen the states run their own shows on pandemic management. And the best of them, by a long shot, has been Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales. It hasn't been unblemished, of course. There was the Ruby Princess debacle that was damaging and an early lesson on the value of quarantine. But overall, New South Wales has carried the biggest load of quarantine returns from overseas. It's managed this well. It's dealt with some serious clusters, but it's kept the state and its schools and its businesses and its communities as open as possible all year. And its borders, I should add. But have a look at how the other states have behaved. Daniel Andrews had the hardest lockdown, then bungled quarantine, made a hash of contact tracing and public information, lost control of the situation, and then punished his state with a lockdown so brutal that it included a worthless curfew. The state's only now opening up again to the rest of the country. Tasmania, the island state, closed itself off, and Peter Gutwein has kept it that way. And of course, the federal government moved in to fix a bad cluster around Launceston early on. Under Mark McGowan, Western Australia, unbelievably, still has the shutters up. In Queensland, a tourist state, Anastasia Palaszczuk won't properly open its borders for another week. And South Australian Premier Stephen Marshall, last week he locked down the whole state, created an enormous trauma and harm with a lockdown that we could all see was unnecessary at the time and what was later exposed as being based on baloney, or pepperoni perhaps. For all this, a remarkable aspect of the pandemic this year has been the media's performance. Journalists have tended to support their premiers, especially in their home states. Premiers have enjoyed public and media support even when they've completely stuffed up. We saw that especially in Victoria. This is partly because the media is just as alarmist and panic-stricken as the premiers. The journos love to whip up fear about the virus, talking about every infection as if it's a serious case or even a fatality. I heard radio bulletins this morning leading with the story that the virus had been detected again in Sydney sewerage. Really? There was no other news around? The media treatment also reflects parochialism. The local media back the local premier to fight the local problem. We're all in this together and all of that. We understand that. But anyway, my point is this. We have 6 premiers in this country. 5 of them have failed to do the right thing by their country in their pandemic response. But the one in the firing line at the moment, the one the media has in their sights, is the only one who's done a proper job. Berejiklian is in strife because earlier this week she had a quick 2-hour COVID test and kept working at Parliament House while she waited for what turned out to be a negative response.
If I was an ordinary citizen, I wouldn't have had any symptoms, so I wouldn't have taken the test, but I went over and above. So if I was an ordinary citizen, I didn't have a scratchy throat, I didn't have a runny nose, I didn't have any, I looked at the website and I didn't have any of the symptoms, but I went over and above and took the test as through an abundance of caution.
But Premier, you broke the rules.
Oh, look, that's all down to interpretation. I took a test which I really didn't need to, but I wanted to. And look, perhaps in that time frame, I should have shut my door and not let anyone in, but I didn't do that.
Now, point taken, of course, Berejiklian did break the guidelines that are inconvenient for all of us. There's a bit of a do as I say, not as I do about this, and she'd better be more careful in the future. But how about some perspective? The thing is, if she wasn't Premier, she probably wouldn't have even had this test. She was being super careful, and yes, I know, she should have isolated. But you see, the media are now going nuts about this. The story is into its 3rd day.
New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian is refusing to admit she broke her own rules after it was revealed she continued with meetings while waiting for the results of a COVID test.
Some journos are even doing stories about the toing and froing between reporters and media advisors who are trying to stop the story or play it down. It's the sort of media byplay that happens 100 times a day around the country on various stories. This sideshow was the lead item on the ABC's national television current affairs show last night.
Australians will tolerate a fair bit from their politicians, but there are a few things that are guaranteed turn-offs. One is a hand in the till. Another is an attitude of do as I say, but not as I do. The New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian, who's almost universally lauded for her handling of the coronavirus pandemic, has now been exposed for ordering the public to follow strict rules that she herself has blatantly broken.
I mean, really? Daniel Andrews destroys a year of schooling for all Victorian kids, crushes businesses and destroys jobs. Stephen Marshall panics and shuts his whole state down based on some ridiculous pizza box theory. Anastasia Palaszczuk shuns tourists from a tourism state, and McGowan won't even let Western Australians come home from other states without 2 weeks quarantine. And the story the media fires up about is Gladys Berejiklian not locking herself in her office for 2 hours. Is it because she's a woman, or because she's a Liberal, or because she's refused to play the panic-stricken, lock everything down game? And listen to the smugness of her Labor neighbour to the north.
Well, that's the matter for her. When I had my COVID test, I had to stay home until I got the all clear.
Oh, yes, Anna stay home. Yes, Palaszczuk stayed home. She also kept Queenslanders apart from dying relatives and stopped businesses from welcoming tourism dollars. Berejiklian made an error. She's since admitted that. But her mistake is a tiny footnote on the endless catalogue of catastrophic blunders, willful overreactions and border obstinance from the other premiers. Perhaps the media just likes an easy hit, an error of judgment that they can all understand, rather than actually delving into the real dilemmas and the difficult consequences of pandemic mismanagement elsewhere in the country. God, there's only one Gladys Berejiklian. You'd want 6, wouldn't you, in this country at the moment? You'd want 6, yet she's in the firing line.